A confused elderly millionaire wandered the streets of Boston alone, but when a poor black newspaper boy tried to help her, the police were called. What happened next left the entire neighborhood in tears. The alarm buzzed at 4:30 a.m. Noah's hand shot out from under the thin blanket, hitting the snooze button with practiced precision. He lay there for exactly 2 minutes, listening to his mother's gentle snoring from the next room of their small apartment. The morning darkness pressed against the window, broken only by the orange glow of street lights. "Get up," he whispered to himself, pushing back the covers. The floor creaked under his feet as he stood. 11 years old, and already familiar with the responsibility of early mornings. In the bathroom, Noah splashed cold water on his face, the pipes groaning in protest. His reflection stared back at him. Close-cropped hair, dark eyes that seemed older than his years. Wearing the clean but worn t-shirt he'd laid out the night before. His stomach growled as he pulled on his jeans and jacket. Opening the kitchen cabinet, he counted their remaining food supplies. 2 packets of instant oatmeal left. His mom wouldn't get paid until Friday, 3 days away. Noah closed the cabinet without taking anything. "Just water today," he muttered, filling a plastic bottle from the tap. The rent notice sat on the counter, red letters screaming final warning. He folded it carefully and tucked it into his backpack, next to his school books. The stack of newspapers waited in the lobby of their apartment building. Noah counted them twice. 57 papers for the Beacon Street route. Rich people's houses. Big houses with security cameras that followed his every move. Outside, the pre-dawn air bit at his exposed skin. Noah shouldered his delivery bag, heavy with papers, and started his route. The streets were empty except for the occasional early morning worker hurrying past, collar turned up against the cold. His phone vibrated in his pocket. A text from his mom. "Rent's due tomorrow. They won't wait anymore." "I'm trying, baby." Noah's throat tightened. He typed back quickly, "I know, Mom. I'll help." He had $28 saved from his paper route. Not enough. Never enough. The houses grew larger as he walked, lawns expanding, driveways lengthening. Security lights flicked on as he approached each property, tracking his movement. Noah kept his head down, focusing on his deliveries. Quick, efficient, invisible. "Hey, boy!" A sharp voice cut through the morning silence. Noah froze, one hand still holding a rolled newspaper. A security guard emerged from the gatehouse of number 247, flashlight beam cutting through the dim light. "What are you doing here?" "Delivering the morning papers, sir." Noah held up his delivery badge, voice steady despite his racing heart. "I do this route every day." The guard's flashlight beam lingered on Noah's face, then dropped to the newspaper in his hand. "Right? Well, make it quick, and stay where the cameras can see you." Noah nodded, completed the delivery, and moved on. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the next paper. The memory of the convenience store incident 3 years ago flashed through his mind. Being accused of shoplifting just because he'd been looking at the candy display too long. His mother's face when she'd arrived to find him sitting in the manager's office, security guards standing over him. The sky lightened gradually as he worked his way down Beacon Street. Through the windows of the mansions, he caught glimpses of their lives. Expensive furniture, artwork on walls, breakfast being prepared by uniformed staff. A boy about his age emerged from one house, wearing a crisp private school uniform, climbing into a waiting car without a glance at his surroundings. Noah checked his phone. 6:45 a.m. School started at 8 o'clock. If he hurried, he could finish his route and maybe find something in the lost and found box for lunch. His stomach cramped at the thought of food. That's when he saw her. An elderly woman in an expensive nightgown and robe, standing barefoot on the sidewalk, looking confused. She turned in slow circles, elegant silver hair catching the early morning light, obviously lost. Noah hesitated. Previous experience had taught him that trying to help could be dangerous. People saw what they wanted to see, a black kid up to no good. But the woman's distress was clear in her face, in the way her hands fluttered like trapped birds. She took an unsteady step toward the street. A car horn blared as it swerved to avoid her. Noah's feet were moving before his brain could catch up, newspaper bag bouncing against his hip as he ran. "Ma'am," he called out, keeping his voice gentle. Ma'am, please stay on the sidewalk. It's not safe. The woman turned toward his voice, revealing striking blue eyes clouded with confusion. I need to get home, she said, her voice cultured but trembling. But I can't remember. A few early morning joggers slowed to watch the scene unfold. Noah saw one of them pull out a phone, starting to record. His pulse quickened. This could go bad fast. But the woman swayed on her feet, and Noah made his choice. He carefully moved closer, making sure to stay where she could see him clearly. My name is Noah, he said, speaking slowly and clearly. I deliver newspapers on this street every morning. Maybe I can help you find your home. The woman's eyes focused on him briefly, then darted away. Home, she repeated. Yes, I need to go home. But everything looks wrong. Her bare feet had started to turn blue in the cold morning air. More phones were appearing now, more people stopping to watch. Noah heard whispers, saw fingers pointing. A car slowed down, window rolling down to reveal a man in a business suit, frowning at the scene. Do you remember what your house looks like, ma'am? Noah asked, trying to ignore the growing audience. Or your address? I know all the houses on this street. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, a police siren wailed in the distance, growing closer. Someone had made a call. Noah's heart rate spiked, but he forced himself to stay calm. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was just trying to help. The woman reached out suddenly, grabbing his arm with surprising strength. Please, she said, her voice clearer for a moment. Please help me get home. The police siren grew louder, and Noah knew the next few minutes would change everything. Red and blue lights painted the street as the police cruiser rounded the corner. Noah's muscles tensed, but the elderly woman's grip on his arm kept him in place. The growing crowd of onlookers parted as two officers stepped out of their vehicle. Step away from the lady, the first officer called out, hand resting on his belt. Now, son. Noah started to move back, but the woman's fingers tightened. No, she said, her voice trembling. He's helping me. I need to get home. The second officer, younger and already holding his phone, spoke into his radio. We've got a possible 207 in progress, Beacon Street area. Noah recognized the code from TV shows, kidnapping. His heart hammered against his ribs. Ma'am, the first officer said, moving closer, are you all right? Did this boy approach you? I don't. The woman's grip loosened as she looked around, confusion clouding her features again. I was having breakfast in my dining room. But then, a woman in expensive running gear stepped forward from the crowd. I saw the whole thing. That boy was talking to her, trying to get her to go somewhere with him. No, Noah said, keeping his voice steady despite his racing pulse. She's lost. I was just trying to help her get home. I deliver papers here every morning. He reached slowly toward his back pocket. I have my route ID. Hands where we can see them. Both officers tensed, and the crowd gasped. Noah froze, arms raised slightly. The elderly woman swayed on her feet. Everything's wrong, she mumbled. The furniture is all wrong. More police cars arrived. Noah could see cell phones recording from every direction. His own phone buzzed in his pocket. Probably his mom, wondering why he wasn't at school yet. He couldn't reach for it. A tall officer with sergeant stripes approached. What's your name, son? Noah Williams, sir. I live on Morton Street. I deliver papers here every morning for the Boston Globe. He spoke clearly, remembering what his mother had taught him about dealing with police. Look them in the eye. Speak respectfully. Keep your hands visible. Stay calm. Where are your parents? My mom's at work. Memorial Hospital. She's a cleaning supervisor. Noah swallowed hard. Please, I was just trying to help. The lady almost walked into traffic. The elderly woman had started shivering in her thin nightgown. She looked at Noah, then at the officers, her eyes growing wide with sudden fear. Who are all these people? Where's Charles? I want Charles. Ma'am, who's Charles? The sergeant asked. My husband. Her voice cracked. He always has breakfast with me. Where is he? An expensive car pulled up, and a man in a security uniform stepped out. That's Mrs. Thompson, he said urgently. From the Thompson estate. She has Alzheimer's. Mr. Thompson passed away 3 years ago. The revelation rippled through the crowd. Noah heard whispers. Eleanor Thompson? The philanthropist? The Thompson Foundation? What's she doing out here? Mrs. Thompson's face crumpled. Charles is gone? She released Noah's arm, stumbling backward. No, he was just here. We were having breakfast. He was reading the paper. Noah moved instinctively to steady her, but multiple voices shouted at once. Don't touch her, Mrs. Thompson screamed, the sound piercing the morning air. Help! Someone help me! She looked directly at Noah, but there was no recognition in her eyes, only terror. Who are you? What do you want? The crowd surged forward. Someone shouted, Get that kid away from her! Another voice, I'm calling the news! The sergeant stepped between Noah and Mrs. Thompson. Son, I need you to come with me to the car. But she needs help, Noah protested. She's barefoot. She's freezing. Step back. A new voice cut through the chaos. A woman in a business suit pushed through the crowd, phone to her ear. I'm Mrs. Thompson's lawyer. Nobody touches my client. More vehicles arrived, private security, news vans, curious neighbors in luxury cars. Noah's phone kept buzzing. The sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows across the expensive homes of Beacon Street. Mrs. Thompson had sunk to the sidewalk, crying softly. Charles, I want to go home. The lawyer crouched beside her, but looked uncertainly around. Does anyone know which house is hers? The estate covers several properties on this street. No one knew. He delivered papers to the Thompson mansion every morning for the past year. The giant white colonial with blue shutters and lion statues guarding the gate. But as he opened his mouth to speak, he saw the warning looks from the officers, the suspicious glares from the crowd. His mother's voice echoed in his memory. Sometimes helping people can put you in danger, baby. You have to be careful. The world isn't fair. He looked at Mrs. Thompson, shivering on the cold concrete, surrounded by people who didn't know how to help her. Then at the phones recording his every move, the officers watching him like he was a threat, the growing crowd of spectators eager for drama on their quiet, wealthy street. The smart thing would be to walk away. He still had papers to deliver, school to attend, a mother to help support. He couldn't afford trouble, couldn't risk becoming another viral video, another statistic. But Mrs. Thompson's earlier words rang in his ears. Please help me get home. Noah took a deep breath and made his decision. He stepped forward, hands raised where everyone could see them. I know where she lives, he said quietly. I can show you. The lawyer's eyes narrowed. And how exactly do you know that? Because I deliver her newspaper every morning at 5:45 a.m. Third house past the stone wall, white colonial with blue shutters and lion statues. There's a fountain in the circular driveway, and the gate code changes every Monday. He paused. Her paper goes in the silver box by the guardhouse, not on the porch. Special instructions. The security guard nodded slowly. He's right. About all of it. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Mrs. Thompson looked up, her blue eyes clearing briefly. Home, she said. Yes. The lions. Charles loved those lions. The lawyer straightened up. We'll handle it from here. Thank you for your assistance. But Mrs. Thompson grabbed Noah's sleeve again. You know the way home? Yes, ma'am. Then you're coming with me? Her voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone used to being obeyed. I trust him, the crowd muttered. The officers exchanged glances. The lawyer sighed. And Noah, his heart pounding but his voice steady, said, I'll help you get home, Mrs. Thompson. I promise. He didn't know it then, but that promise would change both their lives forever. We'll take her in the patrol car, the sergeant announced, reaching for Mrs. Thompson's arm. No, she shrieked, pulling away. I want to walk. With him, she pointed at Noah. He knows the way home. More police cruisers had arrived, blocking both ends of the street. Noah counted 4 news vans now, reporters setting up cameras. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing. 17 missed calls from his mom. Let me call my mother first, Noah said. Please. She'll be worried. The sergeant nodded reluctantly. Noah's hands shook as he dialed. Noah, where are you? The school called. Mom, I'm okay. He cut in. There's a situation on my route. An elderly lady needed help. I'm watching it right now. She interrupted, voice tight with fear. Channel 5 is live. Baby, are there police there? Yes, but I'm fine. I promise. I just need to help Mrs. Thompson get home. Mrs. Thompson? The millionaire? His mother's voice cracked. No, get out of there. Now. I can't, Mom. She trusts me. I have to help. A long pause. Then, I'm coming. Don't move. Don't say anything else to anyone. Mom, no. You can't leave work. Watch me. The line went dead. The lawyer was arguing with the sergeant. This is absurd. We can't let a child escort her. I'm not leaving, Noah said firmly. I promised to get her home. Mrs. Thompson had started shivering again. Someone brought a blanket from one of the patrol cars and draped it over her shoulders. She clutched it tight, looking lost until her eyes found Noah again. You know the lions? She asked. The ones Charles bought in Italy? Yes, ma'am. I see them every morning. They guard your gate. Her face brightened. Yes. Charles said they'd protect us. Are we going there now? If you want to walk, we can walk, Noah said gently. It's not far. A reporter shoved a microphone toward them. Mrs. Thompson, are you being held against your will? Mrs. Thompson screamed again, covering her face. Noah stepped between her and the camera. Back off, the sergeant ordered. Everyone back up. But the crowd had grown too large to control. Phones recorded from every angle. Someone had launched a drone that buzzed overhead. Social media was already exploding. Noah glimpsed a headline on someone's phone. Breaking. Black youth accosts elderly millionaire. His chest tightened. This was exactly what his mother had always warned him about. Noah, a familiar voice cut through the chaos. His mother pushed through the crowd, still wearing her hospital cleaning uniform. Baby, are you okay? Mom, I'm fine. Get away from my son, she snapped at the officers nearby. Then softer, Noah, come here. Now. But before he could move, Mrs. Thompson grabbed his hand. Don't leave, she pleaded. You promised. You know the way home. Noah's mother froze, taking in the scene. Her son's hand clasped by an elderly white woman in a nightgown and police blanket, surrounded by cops and cameras. Mrs. Williams? The sergeant approached. Your son says he delivers papers here? Every morning for the past year, she confirmed, chin raised. He has ID, working papers, everything legal, and you let him work in this neighborhood alone? Noah felt his mother's anger before she spoke. My son earns honest money. He has every right to be here. More sirens approached, an ambulance this time. The paramedics tried to guide Mrs. Thompson toward their vehicle, but she refused to let go of Noah's hand. The lions, she insisted. We need to find the lions. Noah's mother studied Mrs. Thompson's face, then looked at her son. Something passed between them. Years of unspoken understanding about navigating a world that didn't always want them in it. How far to her house? She asked Noah quietly. 3 blocks. She straightened her hospital uniform. All right. We walk. Together. But I'm coming too. The lawyer stepped forward. Mrs. Williams, I must advise against. You can advise whatever you want, Noah's mother cut in. But that woman needs help, and my son gave his word. She turned to the sergeant. We'll walk her home. You can follow if you need to. The sergeant considered this, then nodded to his officers. They began forming a perimeter, pushing back the crowd and media. Mrs. Thompson had started humming softly, an old song Noah didn't recognize. But her grip on his hand remained firm. Ready to go home? He asked her. The lions, she repeated. Charles is waiting. Noah felt the weight of every camera, every suspicious glance, every prejudiced assumption. But he also felt his mother's presence behind him, strong and steady as always. This way, Mrs. Thompson, he said, taking the first step. I'll show you the way. The crowd parted reluctantly. News helicopters circled overhead now, their rotors drowning out the murmurs and whispers. Police cruisers crawled alongside them, lights flashing. Noah's mother walked on Mrs. Thompson's other side, her hospital badge catching the morning sun. Together, they formed an unlikely trio, the confused millionaire, the cleaning woman, and the paper boy, moving slowly down Beacon Street. Charles picked this street, Mrs. Thompson said suddenly. He said we needed somewhere safe. Noah's mother's expression softened. My boy will get you home safe, Mrs. Thompson. That's a promise. They approached the first intersection. Ahead, Noah could see the Thompson estate's stone wall rising above the trees. The lion statues would be just around the corner, guarding the gate like always. But first they had to make it there. And from the growing tension in the air, from the shouts of the reporters and the buzz of the helicopters and the whispered comments from the crowd still following them, Noah knew the hardest part of their journey was just beginning. His mother's hand touched his shoulder briefly, a reminder of everything she'd taught him about being brave, about doing what's right even when the world made it hard. Mrs. Thompson's humming grew louder, more confused. But her feet kept moving forward, one step at a time, trusting Noah to lead the way home. The morning sun beat down on them as they approached the first intersection. Noah felt Mrs. Thompson's hand trembling in his. The police escort had pushed most of the crowd back, but phones still recorded from every angle. His mother walked on Mrs. Thompson's other side, her hospital uniform drawing curious stares. "Red light," Noah said clearly. "We need to wait, Mrs. Thompson." She blinked at the traffic signal. "Charles always drove. I never had to walk." "Almost there," Noah's mother soothed. "Just a little further." A sleek black car slowed beside them, window rolling down. A man in an expensive suit leaned out. "Eleanor?" "Eleanor Thompson." Mrs. Thompson's grip tightened painfully on Noah's hand. Who are you?" "Richard Maxwell from the Foundation Board." "What are you doing out here with these?" He glanced at Noah and his mother. "These people." "Keep moving," Noah's mother said firmly, guiding them forward as the light turned green. Noah recognized the next block from his paper route. "Mrs. Thompson, remember the big oak tree? The one with the bird feeder?" "Birds," she murmured. "Yes." Charles loved to watch the birds. They passed the tree, its branches casting dappled shadows on the sidewalk. More Foundation Board members arrived in luxury cars, parking haphazardly and approaching with concerned expressions. "This is unacceptable," one woman announced, designer heels clicking on the pavement. "Eleanor needs medical attention, not a walk with the help." Noah's mother stiffened, but kept walking. Noah felt heat rise in his cheeks, but remembered what she'd always taught him. Their words can only hurt you if you let them. Mrs. Thompson stumbled suddenly. "I'm tired. Where's Charles?" "Just 2 more blocks," Noah said quietly. "See that stone wall ahead? Your lions are waiting." A news reporter darted in front of them. "Mrs. Thompson, are you being coerced? Blink twice if back off." Noah's mother snapped, physically placing herself between the camera and Mrs. Thompson. "Can't you see she's scared?" The police pushed the reporter back, but more took his place. The crowd had grown again, following at a distance, phones raised. Noah heard snippets of their conversations. "Worth millions. Shouldn't be out alone. Those people probably." He tuned them out, focusing instead on the route he knew by heart. "There's a crack in the sidewalk coming up, Mrs. Thompson. Step carefully." She nodded, following his lead. Her humming had stopped, replaced by rapid, shallow breathing. "Eleanor." Another board member approached. "This is ridiculous. Let us call a car." "No." She shrank away from him. I need." Her eyes darted around in panic. "The lions," Noah reminded her gently. "We're going to the lions." "Yes," she breathed. "The lions. Charles's lions." They turned the corner onto the final block. The Thompson estate stone wall stretched ahead of them, massive iron gates visible in the distance. The lion statues stood guard, just as they did every morning when Noah delivered the paper. Mrs. Thompson stopped walking. "I know this," she whispered. "I know this place." A black SUV screeched to a halt beside them. 2 men in suits emerged. "Mrs. Thompson, we're from estate security. Please, let us." "Don't touch her," Noah's mother warned, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to being underestimated. More vehicles arrived. The Foundation Board members clustered together, making urgent phone calls. The media crews jostled for position. Above them, helicopters continued their noisy circles. Mrs. Thompson's legs buckled. Noah and his mother caught her before she could fall. "I want to sit," she mumbled. "Just for a minute." Noah looked around quickly. "There's a bench by the bus stop. We can rest there." They helped her to the bench, the police forming a barrier against the pressing crowd. Mrs. Thompson sank down, still clutching Noah's hand. "You're doing great," he told her. "Look, You can see your house from here. She squinted at the gates in the distance. The lions, she said again. Charles bought them in Florence. On our honeymoon, her voice strengthened. We had gelato every day. He said the lions would watch over me. Noah's mother touched her shoulder gently. They're still watching, Mrs. Thompson. They'll be happy to see you home. A sleek town car pushed through the crowd. A man in an expensive suit emerged, different from the others. Older, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. That's her personal attorney, one of the board members said. Finally, the lawyer approached slowly, waiting for the police to clear a path. Mrs. Thompson, do you remember me? James Harper. She studied his face. James, yes. You helped Charles with his papers. That's right. He looked at Noah and his mother. I understand you've been helping Mrs. Thompson? My son found her lost on his paper route, Noah's mother explained. We're walking her home. Harper nodded thoughtfully. And you are? Sarah Williams, this is my son, Noah. The paper boy, Mrs. Thompson added. He knows the lions. Understanding crossed Harper's face. Ah, yes. The morning paper delivery. Well, shall we get you home, Mrs. Thompson? She gripped Noah's hand tighter. He promised. He knows the way. Harper studied them for a long moment, then smiled slightly. Then let's all go together. They helped Mrs. Thompson stand. The crowd parted again as they began walking the final stretch. The lion statues grew larger with each step, their stone faces catching the mid-morning sun. Mrs. Thompson's stride strengthened. I remember now, she said clearly. Charles had them shipped from Italy. They arrived on my birthday. They reached the gates. The security guards stepped forward uncertainly, looking between Mrs. Thompson and the growing crowd of observers. It's okay, Noah said. Show them your lions, Mrs. Thompson. You're home. She released his hand for the first time, approaching the gates slowly. Her fingers traced the stone mane of the nearest lion. Hello, old friends, she whispered. Then she turned back to Noah, her eyes suddenly sharp and clear. Thank you for bringing me home. The gates began to swing open. Beyond them, the circular driveway led to the massive colonial house where Noah delivered the paper each morning. Staff members spilled out the front door, rushing down the steps. Perhaps you and your mother would come inside? Harper suggested quietly. There are some things we should discuss. Noah looked at his mother. She nodded slowly. As they passed through the gates, Noah heard the crowd murmuring behind them. The news helicopters hovered, cameras flashing. But none of that seemed to matter anymore. Mrs. Thompson had found her lions. She was home, and somehow, Noah knew their story wasn't over yet. The Thompson estate's front doors swung open. A stream of people rushed down the marble steps. Household staff in uniforms, medical personnel in scrubs, and security teams with earpieces. Wait, Mrs. Thompson said, stopping abruptly. Her hand found Noah's again. Too many people? Noah felt her pulse racing through her grip. The morning had grown hot, and sweat trickled down his back. His mom stood close behind them, her hospital badge glinting in the sunlight. Mrs. Thompson, you need to come inside now, a nurse called out, hurrying down the steps. Your morning medications. No. Mrs. Thompson backed away. Where's Charles? I want Charles. The nurse reached for her arm, but Mrs. Thompson jerked away, nearly falling. Noah steadied her carefully. Everyone, please. James Harper, her attorney, raised his voice. Give her space. She's had a difficult morning. The staff retreated reluctantly. Behind the gates, the media crews pressed closer, cameras clicking rapidly. Somewhere in the crowd, a drone buzzed overhead. Eleanor! A sharp voice cut through the commotion. A tall woman in expensive clothes strode down the steps. Mother, what are you thinking, wandering off like this? Mrs. Thompson's grip tightened painfully on Noah's hand. Catherine, your daughter, Noah's mother supplied quietly. Right, Mrs. Thompson? Ah, yes. Catherine. Mrs. Thompson's voice trembled. But you were in London. I flew back as soon as they called. Getting on the Concorde right now would be faster than your social media disaster spreading. Catherine Thompson's heels clicked against the pavement as she approached. Her eyes swept over Noah and his mother. And who are these people? The paper boy, Mrs. Thompson said. He knows the lions. Catherine's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose. Mother, you need to come inside. Now, the board is having an emergency meeting about the foundation. I believe, James Harper interjected smoothly, that Mrs. Thompson might be more comfortable if young Noah and his mother accompanied her. Absolutely not. Catherine's voice could have frozen water. We have more than enough witnesses to this situation. Noah's mother stepped forward. My son helped your mother when no one else would. He kept her safe? Safe? Catherine laughed sharply. He paraded her through the streets while people filmed it. Do you have any idea what this looks like? Like someone choosing kindness over appearances? Noah's mother suggested quietly. More vehicles pulled into the circular driveway. Expensive cars carrying foundation board members. They emerged in suits and designer dresses, phones pressed to their ears. This is a nightmare, one man announced. The press is having a field day. Confused Millionaire led through streets by unknown youth. We need damage control. Mrs. Thompson had started humming again, her eyes darting between faces. Charles, she called out. Charles, where are you? Daddy's gone, Mother, Catherine said sharply. He's been gone for 3 years. Now, please come inside before you embarrass yourself further. Mrs. Thompson's humming stopped abruptly. Tears filled her eyes. Ma'am, Noah said softly, would you like to see your garden? I deliver your paper there every morning. The roses are blooming. Her face cleared slightly. Roses. Yes. Charles planted those for me. Enough. Catherine snapped. Security, please escort my mother inside. And remove these people from the property. 2 guards stepped forward, but James Harper raised his hand. Actually, Catherine, as your mother's legal counsel, I must advise against any forced movement. Mrs. Thompson appears to trust young Noah, and in her current state is precisely why we need to get her inside and medicated, Catherine interrupted. Look at her. She's still in her nightgown. More police cars arrived outside the gates. The sergeant who'd followed them approached Harper. Sir, we need statements from everyone involved. Of course, Harper nodded. But first, let's get Mrs. Thompson somewhere quiet. He turned to Noah. You mentioned the garden? Noah nodded. There's a bench by the roses. She'll be able to see the lions from there. Catherine opened her mouth to object, but Mrs. Thompson spoke first. The roses. Charles's roses. Please. Harper smiled gently. Then that's where we'll go. Catherine, why don't you call off the board meeting? Your mother needs calm, not committees. Catherine's perfectly made-up face tightened, but she stepped back, phone already in hand. Noah guided Mrs. Thompson along the curved path he knew from his paper route. His mother and Harper followed close behind, while the staff hovered uncertainly near the house. The garden spread out before them, immaculate beds of flowers, carefully trimmed hedges, and in the center, a riot of red roses climbing an elegant trellis. A wooden bench sat in their shade. Mrs. Thompson's steps quickened. Oh, she breathed. Oh yes, this is right. They helped her sit on the bench. She patted the space beside her, looking at Noah. You'll stay? Just for a moment? Noah glanced at his mother, who nodded. He sat carefully beside Mrs. Thompson, aware of the eyes watching from the house, the cameras still clicking beyond the gates. I deliver your paper here every morning, he said quietly. Right to that silver box by the guardhouse. I always stop to smell the roses. Mrs. Thompson smiled, her first real smile of the day. Charles said, he said roses need attention. Love, she touched a bloom gently. Like people do. James Harper cleared his throat softly. Mrs. Thompson, when you're ready, we do need to talk about what happened this morning. Got lost, she murmured. Everything looked wrong. But then, she patted Noah's hand. Then someone knew the way home. Noah's mother wiped her eyes quickly. Even Harper looked moved. From the house, they heard Catherine's voice rising. This is unacceptable. The press is calling it a kidnapping attempt. Mrs. Thompson flinched at her daughter's tone. Noah spoke quickly, trying to distract her. The lions can see us here, Mrs. Thompson. They're still watching over you, just like Mr. Thompson wanted. She looked toward the gates, where the stone lions stood guard. Yes, she said clearly. Yes, they are. Then she turned to Harper. James, I want to tell you something. Well, I remember. Harper stepped closer, pulling out a small notebook. Of course, Mrs. Thompson. The boy, she said, her voice stronger than it had been all morning. Noah. He helped when others only stared. Filmed. Whispered. She gripped Noah's hand. I want to help him too. Mother, Catherine called from the house. The doctor is here. You need to come in now. Mrs. Thompson stood shakily. Promise you'll stay? She asked Noah. Just until I talk to the doctor? Noah looked at his mother again. She glanced at her watch. Her shift at the hospital had started hours ago. But she nodded. We'll stay, Mrs. Thompson, she said. Take all the time you need. As they helped Mrs. Thompson toward the house, Noah caught a glimpse of his reflection in a window. His paper delivery bag still hung at his hip, the remaining newspapers inside. He'd never finished his route. But somehow, he knew he delivered something more important today. Something that couldn't be printed on paper or captured by cameras. He delivered hope. And now, watching Mrs. Thompson climb the steps with renewed purpose, he wondered what that hope might grow into. The Thompson mansion's foyer dwarfed Noah's entire apartment building. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceiling murals, their light dancing across marble floors. Mrs. Thompson's slippered feet made no sound as she walked, but Noah's worn sneakers squeaked against the polished stone. This way, a uniformed maid directed them toward a side room. The doctor is waiting in the study. Catherine Thompson stepped in front of them. Mother will see the doctor alone. No. Mrs. Thompson's voice cracked. They stay. The paper boy and his mother. Mrs. Thompson, the doctor, a gray-haired man with round glasses, emerged from the study. Let's get you checked out. She gripped Noah's hand tighter. They stay. The doctor glanced at Harper, who nodded slightly. Catherine threw up her hands and stalked away, heels clicking sharply on the marble. The study felt warmer than the foyer. Dark wood panels lined the walls, and leather-bound books filled floor-to-ceiling shelves. A massive desk dominated one end of the room, while comfortable chairs clustered around a fireplace at the other. Sit here, Mrs. Thompson. The doctor patted a high-back chair. Let me check your vital signs. Noah tried to step back, but Mrs. Thompson wouldn't release his hand. His mother stood behind them, her hospital uniform looking out of place among the expensive furnishings. Blood pressure's a bit high, the doctor murmured. Have you taken your morning medications? Before Mrs. Thompson could answer, Catherine burst back into the room. The foundation board is demanding answers, and the media circus outside is getting worse. Perhaps we should address the immediate concerns, Harper suggested. Mrs. Thompson, do you remember what happened this morning? She frowned. Breakfast. I was having breakfast. In your nightgown? Catherine cut in. Really, Mother? Charles was reading the paper. Mrs. Thompson continued, as if her daughter hadn't spoken. But then, he wasn't, and nothing looked right. Mr. Thompson passed away 3 years ago, the doctor said gently. Do you remember that? Tears filled Mrs. Thompson's eyes. Sometimes I forget. Noah's mother stepped forward. Maybe we should let Mrs. Thompson rest before. And who exactly are you? Catherine demanded. Other than the mother of the boy who caused this entire situation, my son helped your mother when everyone else was too busy filming her distress. Noah's mother replied evenly. He treated her with dignity. Dignity? Catherine laughed harshly. Have you seen social media? The headlines? Lost millionaire led through streets by strange child. The foundation's reputation. That's enough. The voice came from the doorway. A tall man in an impeccable suit stood there. Another foundation board member, but this one older, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Eleanor, do you remember me? George Maxwell. Mrs. Thompson squinted at him. George, yes. You and Charles play golf. That's right. He entered the room slowly. I saw the security footage. Of this morning, Catherine straightened. Then you understand why we need to handle this situation immediately. I do. Maxwell smiled slightly. I saw a confused and frightened woman being treated with more compassion by a young stranger than by many who should have known better. The room fell silent except for the distant sound of helicopters still circling outside. The boy, Mrs. Thompson said suddenly. Noah. He knows about the lions, the statues by the gate. Maxwell asked. She nodded. Charles bought them in Florence. For protection. She turned to Noah. You visit them every morning? Yes, ma'am, Noah replied. When I deliver your paper. Show me, she said, standing shakily. Show me where you leave it. The doctor started to object, but Harper raised his hand. Let her walk if she wants to. The exercise might help. They followed Mrs. Thompson through the house, their odd procession reflecting in gleaming mirrors and polished silver. The elderly woman in her nightgown and robe, the young black boy still clutching his paper delivery bag, his mother in her hospital uniform, the lawyer, the doctor, the board member, and Catherine bringing up the rear, tapping furiously on her phone. Mrs. Thompson led them to a side door that opened onto the circular driveway. The silver newspaper box stood exactly where Noah had described it, next to the guardhouse. Every morning, she asked Noah. Yes, ma'am. 5:45 a.m. I'll make sure it's tucked in properly, so it doesn't get wet. She touched the box gently. Charles always read the paper at breakfast. Every morning. Mother, Catherine stepped forward. The board is waiting. We need to discuss damage control. Damage? Mrs. Thompson turned to face her daughter. What damage? The media coverage, the social media storm, the potential impact on the foundation's reputation. I got lost, Mrs. Thompson interrupted. I was confused, scared. No one stopped. They just stared. Filmed. She straightened her shoulders. Except him. Maxwell cleared his throat. The security footage shows everything. This young man kept your mother safe, Catherine. Led her home, while others, including some of our own foundation members, simply stood by and recorded the incident on their phones. Catherine's face flushed. That's not. My mind plays tricks sometimes, Mrs. Thompson continued. I forget things. Important things. She touched Noah's shoulder. But I won't forget this. From inside the house, they heard raised voices. More board members arriving, staff rushing about, phones ringing. We should go, Noah's mother said quietly. Mrs. Thompson needs rest. No. Mrs. Thompson's voice carried the authority of decades of commanding rooms much larger than this. James, I need you to draft something. While my mind is clear, Harper pulled out his notebook. Of course, Mrs. Thompson. The boy's mother, Sarah Williams, the first one on staff. Head of household operations. She turned to Noah's mother. You manage cleaning crews at the hospital? Yes, ma'am. For 6 years now. Good. You'll start here instead. Better pay. Benefits. She squeezed Noah's hand. And a college fund for your son? Catherine stepped forward. Mother, you can't just... I can. Mrs. Thompson's voice was steel. My money. My house. My choice. The board can discuss it at the next meeting, Maxwell interrupted smoothly. Which I'll chair, as usual. Catherine's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and paled slightly. The press, they're running with a different angle now. Local youth heroes save confused elder. She looked up. It's trending. Truth usually finds its way out, Maxwell observed mildly. Mrs. Thompson had started to sway slightly on her feet. The doctor stepped forward. You need to rest now. Your medication. Yes, she agreed. Tired. But first. She turned to Noah. You'll still bring my paper? Every morning. Noah smiled. Yes, ma'am. 5:45 a.m. Good. She patted his cheek. The lions will watch for you. As the doctor led Mrs. Thompson away, she paused at the door. Charles would have liked you, she said softly. He believed in helping people find their way home. Noah watched her disappear into the mansion. His mother's hand found his shoulder, squeezing gently. Well, Harper said, flipping his notebook closed. I believe we have some paperwork to discuss. Mrs. Williams, shall we step into my office? Catherine stood frozen, phone forgotten in her hand, watching as her mother's words reshaped the world she thought she knew. And by the gates, the stone lions stood guard, their shadows stretching across the driveway as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky. The grandfather clock in the Thompson mansion's dining room struck 7. Noah sat at the massive mahogany table, his worn sneakers barely touching the oriental rug beneath. His mother sat beside him, still in her hospital uniform, but with her badge removed and her hair smoothed back. More pot roast. Mrs. Peterson, the cook, leaned between them with a silver serving platter. No, thank you, Noah's mother replied. It was delicious. Mrs. Thompson sat at the head of the table, now dressed in an elegant blue dress, her silver hair neatly styled. She'd slept most of the afternoon after taking her medication, then insisted Noah and his mother stay for dinner. Charles always said, she remarked, touching her water glass, that you know people best when you share their table. Catherine Thompson sat stiffly at the other end, pushing food around her plate. She'd spent the afternoon in meetings with the foundation board, emerging with tight lips and furrowed brows. James Harper spread papers on the table beside his plate. Mrs. Williams, if you could sign here and here. He pointed to marked lines on official-looking documents. This confirms your new position in Noah's education fund. Noah's mother's hand trembled slightly as she signed. This is very generous, Mrs. Thompson. Generous? Catherine cut in. It's unprecedented. The board. George Maxwell interrupted from his seat near Mrs. Thompson, voted to support Eleanor's decision. Unanimously, I might add. Catherine's fork clattered against her plate. After you strong-armed them with that security footage, sometimes, Maxwell said mildly, people need to see truth plainly to recognize it. Mrs. Thompson had started humming softly, her eyes distant. Noah recognized the same tune from their walk that morning. What's that song, Mrs. Thompson? He asked. She focused on him. Oh, Charles used to play it on the piano. For our anniversary. She pointed to the grand piano visible through the dining room doors. Every year, Mother, Catherine set down her napkin. You need to rest. It's been a long day. Yes, Mrs. Thompson agreed. But a good day. Found my way home. She smiled at Noah. Thanks to the paper boy. The evening news played silently on a television in the corner, showing footage from the morning. The narrative had shifted dramatically since the first reports. Now it showed Noah carefully guiding Mrs. Thompson, his mother's protective presence, the dignity of their slow walk home. The foundation's publicity team did well, Harper observed. Public response has been overwhelmingly positive. Catherine snorted. After we spent all day doing damage control, the only damage, Maxwell said quietly, was in how long it took some of us to recognize simple human kindness. Mrs. Peterson appeared with dessert, elaborate chocolate mousse in crystal dishes. Noah took a small bite, trying to remember his mother's lessons about fancy dining etiquette. Noah, Mrs. Thompson said suddenly, her voice clearer than it had been all evening. Tell me about school. I go to Boston East Public, ma'am. 7th grade. Grades? Mostly A's, his mother answered proudly. He reads everything he can get his hands on. Mrs. Thompson nodded. The education fund. It's for any college? Yes, Harper confirmed. Full tuition, room, and board at any accredited institution. Noah's fork froze halfway to his mouth. Any college? Any college you can get into, his mother said firmly. Which means you keep those grades up. Charles believed in education, Mrs. Thompson said. Built libraries. Scholarships? She frowned slightly. Catherine, didn't you handle the foundation's education grants? Catherine shifted in her chair. Yes, Mother. We've provided scholarships to hundreds of students. But not enough, Mrs. Thompson murmured. Never enough? She turned to Harper. James, I want to expand the education program. Double it? Mother! Catherine stood up. You can't just. My money, Mrs. Thompson said simply. My choice. She smiled at Noah. More paper boys should go to college. The grandfather clock chimed the half hour. Outside the dining room windows, security lights illuminated the garden where they'd sat that morning. The roses glowed softly in the artificial light. Getting late, Mrs. Thompson said. You'll come back tomorrow? With the paper? Yes, ma'am, Noah replied. 5:45? Good. She stood slowly. Catherine, walk with me to my room? Catherine blinked, surprised. Of course, Mother. As they left the dining room, Noah heard Mrs. Thompson say, You were in such a hurry to grow up. Always rushing. But kindness takes time. Harper gathered his papers. Mrs. Williams, the HR team will contact you tomorrow about starting your new position. The salary we discussed will begin immediately. Noah's mother wiped her eyes quickly. Thank you. All of you. Don't thank us, Maxwell said, standing. Thank your son for reminding us what the Thompson Foundation was built for in the first place. They walked through the mansion's grand foyer, past priceless artworks and antique furniture. The stone lions were just visible through the front windows, standing guard in the darkness. Noah, Mrs. Thompson called from the top of the stairs. She stood there in her blue dress, Catherine supporting her elbow. "The lions will watch for you. Every morning." "Yes, ma'am," he called back. "I'll be here." Outside, the night air felt cool after the warmth of the mansion. News vans still lingered at the gates, but fewer than before. Tomorrow there would be new stories, new dramas. But something permanent had changed here today. Noah's mother squeezed his hand as they walked to the bus stop. "You did good, baby." "Real good, Mom?" he asked quietly. "Are we really going to be okay now?" She looked back at the mansion, its windows glowing warmly in the darkness. "Yeah, baby. We are." The last thing Noah saw before the bus turned the corner was the stone lions, their shadows stretching in the security lights. Standing guard, just as they had this morning. Just as they would tomorrow at 5:45, when he returned with the paper. Because some things he was learning were more reliable than memory. Some things, like kindness, found their way home every time. Noah's alarm buzzed at 4:30 a.m., just like always. But this morning, something was different. The apartment smelled of coffee and toast. His mother was already awake. "Made you breakfast," she said when he entered the kitchen. She wore a new outfit, tags still attached. "Got to look proper for my first day." Noah sat at their small table, staring at the plate of eggs and toast. "You didn't have to eat," she interrupted. "You've got papers to deliver." He took a bite, the toast still warm with butter. His mother sipped her coffee, reading through the paperwork Harper had given her yesterday. "Says here I supervise all household operations. Staffing, scheduling, maintenance." She shook her head. "Double my hospital salary, plus benefits." "You deserve it, Mom." She reached across the table, squeezed his hand. "Eat up. Your papers are waiting." The street felt different as they walked together. Neighbors who usually hurried past stopped to greet them. Someone had seen them on the news. Another had read about them online. "That was a good thing you did, son," Mr. Johnson, the retired mailman, called from his porch. The stack of papers waited in the lobby as usual. Noah counted them twice, 57. His mother helped him load them into his delivery bag. "I'll walk with you," she said. "My new job doesn't start till 8. They moved through the pre-dawn streets together. At each house, Noah made his usual careful delivery. But today, lights flicked on as he passed. Curtains twitched. People were watching. "Famous now," his mother murmured. "Don't want to be famous," Noah replied. "Just want to do my job." They turned on a Beacon Street just as the sky began to lighten. The Thompson estate loomed ahead, its gates gleaming in the security lights. The stone lions stood guard, just as they had yesterday. A guard stepped out of the gatehouse. "Good morning, Noah." "Mrs. Williams," he tipped his hat. "Mrs. Thompson is waiting in the garden." Noah checked his watch. "But it's only 5:30. She's been up since 5. Insisted on waiting. The gates swung open. Noah and his mother walked up the curved driveway, past the spot where yesterday's drama had unfolded. Mrs. Thompson sat on the garden bench, wrapped in an elegant robe, a nurse hovering nearby. "Right on time," she called out when she saw them. With the paper, Noah approached the silver box, carefully tucking in today's edition. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson. Sit with me? Just for a moment." He glanced at his mother, who nodded. "Got time?" Mrs. Thompson patted the bench beside her. "Charles loved the morning paper. Said you couldn't trust those computers everyone uses now." She smiled. "The real news," he said, "comes on paper." "Mother." Catherine's voice carried from the house. "What are you doing out here?" "Waiting for my paper," Mrs. Thompson replied calmly. "Like Charles did?" Catherine emerged onto the patio, already dressed for the office in an expensive suit. "You should be resting." "I've rested enough." Mrs. Thompson turned to Noah's mother. "Sarah, James Harper will meet you in the study at 8. He has all the staff files ready." "Yes, ma'am." Noah's mother straightened unconsciously. "I'll be here." A sleek car pulled up the driveway. George Maxwell stepped out, carrying a briefcase. "Eleanor," he called. "Beautiful morning for a paper delivery." Mrs. Thompson smiled. "George always understands." Catherine checked her phone. "The foundation board." "Can wait," Maxwell interrupted. "Some things are more important than meetings." More cars arrived. Staff members parking for the morning shift. A catering van delivering breakfast supplies. The household coming to life. "Noah," Mrs. Thompson said suddenly. Your school principal called yesterday. After the news, Noah's stomach tightened. Ma'am? Wanted to know if the foundation might fund some new program sciences. Arts. She patted his hand. Said you were one of his best students. I try my best. Better than trying, his mother said quietly. You do what's right. A familiar news van pulled up outside the gates. Catherine stepped forward, but Maxwell raised his hand. Let them film, he said. Let them see what the Thompson Foundation really stands for. Mrs. Thompson stood slowly. Time for breakfast. Sarah, walk with me? We should discuss the household schedules. Noah's mother straightened her new clothes. Of course, Mrs. Thompson. And Noah? Mrs. Thompson turned back. You'll come by after school? The library here. Charles collected books for years. Someone should read them. Noah's heart jumped. Yes, ma'am. I like that. As they walked back to the gates, Noah and his mother heard Catherine's voice. Mother, about yesterday. I'm sorry. I was wrong. Mrs. Thompson's reply floated after them. We all get lost sometimes, dear. The trick is finding our way back. The news crew filmed as Noah and his mother left the estate. But this time, they walked tall. No more trying to be invisible. At the end of Beacon Street, they had to part ways. His mother headed home to change for her first day. Noah still had papers to deliver. Mom, he called after her. You think things will stay different? She turned back, smiled. Some changes stick, baby. When they come from the heart. Noah touched his delivery bag, heavy with remaining papers. The morning sun caught the metal clasps, making them shine like something precious. Because sometimes the most valuable things weren't the ones locked behind gates. Sometimes they were as simple as a paper route, a helping hand, a moment of kindness. His phone buzzed. A text from his mother. Proud of you, baby. Noah smiled, shouldered his bag, and headed off to finish his route. After all, there were still papers to deliver. And somewhere behind him, stone lions stood guard, watching overpromises kept and lives changed, one morning paper at a time. 1 month after that life-changing morning, Noah still woke at 4:30 a.m. But now he woke to the smell of breakfast cooking and the sound of his mother preparing for her day as head of household operations at the Thompson estate. French toast this morning, she called as he entered their kitchen. The room looked different now, new appliances, fresh paint, repairs they'd never been able to afford before. The red, final notice, warnings were gone. Big day, she said, sliding a plate in front of him. First foundation board meeting. Noah adjusted his tie new, like the suit he wore. You sure I should go? Mrs. Thompson insisted. She straightened his collar. Said the board needs to meet the young man who reminded them what the foundation stands for. The morning paper route hadn't changed. Noah still delivered 57 papers along Beacon Street. But now people knew his name. They waved from windows, left him bottles of water on hot days, called out greetings as he passed. At the Thompson estate gates, the guard smiled. Morning, Noah. Big crowd today. Board meetings got everyone showing up early. The stone lions stood as always, casting long shadows in the rising sun. Noah made his usual delivery to the silver box, then headed for the garden. Mrs. Thompson waited on her bench, as she had every morning for the past month. Right on time, she said, patting the space beside her. Her eyes were clear today. A good day. Charles would have liked that. Morning, Mrs. Thompson. Noah sat carefully, mindful of his new suit. Ready for the meeting? George has everything prepared. She touched a rose bloom gently. Foundations changing, growing, like these flowers. Catherine emerged from the house, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She'd changed over the past month, softer somehow, less sharp around the edges. She handed 1 cup to her mother, the other to Noah. Board members are arriving, she said. But Mother insisted on waiting for her paper first. Mrs. Thompson smiled. Priorities, dear. Charles taught me that. Cars began filling the circular driveway. Foundation board members in expensive suits, carrying briefcases and tablets. But they were different now, too. They greeted Noah by name, asked about school, talked about the changes coming to the foundation. Double the education budget, George Maxwell announced, joining them in the garden. Plus new community outreach programs. Eleanor's ideas are transforming everything. Noah's mother appeared, dressed professionally in her role as head of household operations. The staff respected her now. She'd proven herself capable and compassionate, just like her son. "Time for the meeting," she said. "Noah, you ready?" Inside the mansion's grand conference room, Noah sat between his mother and Mrs. Thompson. The long table gleamed with morning sunlight streaming through tall windows. Board members filled their seats, papers rustling, coffee cups clinking. Maxwell stood at the head of the table. "First, I'd like to introduce our special guest, Noah Williams, whose actions 1 month ago reminded us all of the Thompson Foundation's core mission." Noah stood briefly, his heart pounding. The board members applauded. Not the polite, distant applause of the wealthy for the less fortunate, but genuine appreciation. "Now," Maxwell continued, "let's discuss the expansion of our education initiative." Mrs. Thompson? She rose slowly, her voice clear and strong. "Charles built this foundation to help people find their way. Sometimes that means college scholarships. Sometimes it means a chance at a better job." She smiled at Noah's mother. "And sometimes it means seeing people for who they really are, not what we assume them to be." Catherine stood next to her mother. "The new programs will focus on community integration, breaking down barriers, creating opportunities, like Charles wanted," Mrs. Thompson added softly. The meeting continued, but Noah found his thoughts drifting to that morning 1 month ago. How different would things be if he'd walked past Mrs. Thompson? If he'd let fear or past experience stop him from helping? His phone buzzed quietly. A text from his friend Marcus. "Saw you on the news again. They're calling you the kid who changed the Thompson Foundation." Noah typed back, "Just delivered a paper." But it had been more than that. His simple act of kindness had rippled outward, touching lives beyond his imagination. The Foundation's new programs would help hundreds of families like his. Kids like him would get chances they'd never had before. The meeting ended with another round of applause. Board members lingered, talking excitedly about new possibilities, new directions. Mrs. Thompson touched Noah's arm. "Walk with me? To the lions?" They went outside together, the morning sun now high above the trees. The stone lions stood as they always had, but Noah saw them differently now. They weren't just guards. They were reminders of kindness, of courage, of doing what's right. "Charles would have liked this," Mrs. Thompson said, touching one lion's stone mane. "All these changes, all this hope, the Foundation's doing good work," Noah replied. "Because of you." Her eyes were sharp, present. "One person, one choice. That's all it takes sometimes." Catherine joined them by the gates. "Mother, the press want interviews about the new initiatives." "Let them wait." Mrs. Thompson smiled. "Some moments need to be lived, not recorded." Noah's mother appeared with his delivery bag. "Ready for school, babies?" He nodded, then turned to Mrs. Thompson. "See you tomorrow morning? 5:45. The lions and I will be waiting." She hugged him suddenly. This wealthy, white woman who'd once been a stranger in distress. "Thank you, Noah, for helping me find my way home." As Noah walked to school that morning, his tie straight and his delivery bag empty, he thought about paths. How some led you exactly where you expected, and others took you places you never imagined. His phone buzzed again. Another text from his mother. "Education Board approved the new school programs. You started something big, baby." Noah looked back at the Thompson estate. The stone lions stood proud in the morning sun, guardians of more than just gates now. They watched over possibilities, over changes, over hope. And tomorrow morning at 5:45, they'd watch him deliver another paper. Because some routines were worth keeping, even after everything else changed. Some paths, he learned, led exactly where you needed to go, even if you didn't know it when you first stepped onto them. All you had to do was be brave enough to take that first step, and kind enough to help others find their way home.